It's opening night for the Pelicans, and the biggest question remains, who's starting for New Orleans? And will they be starting the next game? In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'll tell you why Willie Green needs to decide on a starting lineup and why the injury report makes it tough. It's a Wednesday opening night episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday. It's finally here. Pelicans opening night. I am unfortunately missing this being on the road. I will be back at the end of the week. We'll be back to the normal backdrop and sound and everything starting on Friday as well. But I'm excited to be with y'all here because this is going to be a fun game and there's still a lot of questions we need answers. And we're going to look at the starting lineup in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Who's starting? Why the injury report is complicating it. We have status designations for Zion Williamson, for Dejounte Murray as well, but which five are starting? And here's the thing, no matter who it is, Willie Green needs to commit to a starting unit for the first 10 games or so, and I'll tell you why. And then we've got even more of your spicy takes in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000, almost 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well here. It's going to be a lot of fun. And don't forget the Locked On Pelicans newsletter. That's over in the link down below. You can see it everywhere. You kind of are looking at this right now. But I want to get into, and of course, become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. A lot of stuff we've talked about in the offseason has kind of come to fruition in training camp, in preseason, and some of it's going to come true in the game tonight. It's opening night against the Chicago Bulls in the Smoothie King Center. And who is starting for the New Orleans Pelicans? Right? It feels like a complete mystery of what we're going to see. And it's complicated by the injury report from Tuesday's practice. Zion Williamson did not practice on Tuesday with an illness. He's going to be a game time decision on Wednesday night. Dejounte Murray was also absent due to personal reasons. They expected him back Tuesday afternoon, get a workout in, and then he's also going to be a game time decision. I expect Murray to definitely play. I think Zion is more likely to play than not. But who are the rest of the starters? Ingram and Herb Jones are good to go. They feel like locks. But then it comes down to, is it CJ McCollum? And they go with a small ball lineup, and more on that in the next segment and this one too. Or are they going to go with a more traditional center? I don't know. I don't know if anyone other than Willie Green knows right now. They didn't try any of these lineups out for the most part during preseason because Zion and Ingram didn't play together. That doesn't feel ideal here. Now, the night before game one of the regular season, we don't know the starting lineup. We don't is the key. Willie Green has said he has an idea of who he plans to start. He's definitely decided by now, assuming those guys are good to go. So it doesn't matter if I don't know, if other media doesn't know, if you don't know, as long as the head coach knows and the team knows what the game plan is. But no matter what, it's untested, and that isn't ideal. Preseason was rocky for New Orleans, and the Pelicans did that to themselves by not playing that small ball lineup, likely their best lineup, one single time. Brandon Ingram didn't play the first two preseason games. Zion didn't play in the finale. So we don't know if that unit is good or how many minutes they can effectively play together. Will it shoot enough threes? Will there be other issues with it? I have no clue. Now, the Pelicans have seen it in practice, in training camp, but you haven't seen it against other NBA teams. That doesn't feel ideal to me here. I don't like this. I think they've gone about preseason very much in the wrong way. And if that is the starting lineup they use, and it doesn't work, how long do you need to give it? Is that 10 games of using it but it not being effective? And does that mean you get off to a 2-8 start? Something like that, when maybe you could have tested it out in preseason and at least worked through those kinks or realized no, we can't run this for the majority of a game. Now you might lose actual meaningful basketball games because of that. I do not like the approach of what they've done with it. There's arguments to be made for a small ball lineup and for a traditional center lineup. Small ball puts your best 5 players out there on the court, or 5 of your best 6 when Trey Murphy is healthy, of which he is not right now. I just like the idea of putting your best guys on the court and figuring out and go and play some basketball. Can defensive rebounding be an issue? Yeah. But if you're an everydayer, we talked about this, and I'm not as worried about defensive rebounding because it was more good than bad in the preseason. So I think this team has proven they can do that. Can they score, though, when they start a traditional center? Maybe that fixes the defensive rebounding issues, but if you just watch that Boston Celtics game against the New York Knicks on opening night, you know how important court spacing and three-point shooting is in the league right now. That lineup doesn't have it. If you take CJ out of there, it's not going to be great. He's going to be the best shooter in that lineup. Ingram, in the one preseason game scored well, but didn't fit into what this team's going to need around Zion Williamson as much. They're going to need him to shoot more threes. And he was absolutely trying to shoot more threes. Just maybe it was, a one-game thing, and maybe that'll get better. But you understand what I'm trying to say. There's merits to both of this, and we don't know which one's better when maybe you would have more of an answer right now. Again, maybe practice tells you, but there's no replacement for playing against other teams that don't know what you're trying to do for the most part. It's one thing to go and practice against backups on your team, but putting those guys in against starters for opponents also matters too. And if you have certain concepts you're trying to run and you're just doing some scrimmages 5-on-5 and the other team knows what the starters are trying to do, they're just going to naturally try and take that away. And they're going to focus on that. And is that actually a good, true test? And I don't think the answer is yes to that sort of thing. So I don't love this. There should be more answers than questions for such a pivotal season for the Pelicans, and there isn't right now. I think there's enough talent here that this might not matter, that they should be fine, that they can still win a lot of games, even without a traditional center, if they go small ball. But can small ball only maybe be used in limited doses? More on that in the next segment, by the way. Or is that what you want to run with? And does that create issues? Or does it really work? I would like to know. And I don't want to have to play the Chicago Bulls to find that out, let alone where maybe we don't even get an answer in this game. If Murray doesn't play, if Zion, more importantly, doesn't play, we don't have an answer to that, and it's not an ideal situation. In a weird way, this kind of sucks, and the Pelicans did it to themselves with the way they've handled some of these things. So tonight is really, it feels like it's like game 0, not just game 1, but game 0 for New Orleans, as we're going to really start to learn who this team is. Identity here when it comes to that, and that's an important thing, and I want to talk about that more coming up next. There's been talk about Willie Green using different starting lineups depending on the opponent. Small ball one night, traditional center anchored lineup the next night, and while that makes sense in theory, coming up next when it comes to this, I'm going to tell you why I hate that idea. Hate it. I'll explain why. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. NBA fans, Pelicans fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And that's over at FanDuel.com. The opening night line, Pelicans -7.5 over the Chicago Bulls. That might change a little bit with the news of Zion Williamson being a game time decision. Same for Dejounte Murray, but 7.5. You can put $5 down on that and then get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place that first $5 bet. And all you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to get started. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. Make us your first listen. All of that here. It's going to be a fun Pelican season. We're going to be making sense of it all for you. Just like we did in yesterday's show of why the Trey Murphy extension was important, why it's a good contract, or if it was a bad contract, I would have told you, and how it impacts other guys on the team. It's not just about Trey getting paid. It's about what it does to CJ McCollum, to Brandon Ingram. Go give that a listen if you haven't. The everydayers already have. And now, Locked On Pelicans has a newsletter. We are introducing the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com, and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter. We've got a couple days of it out already, issues, I don't really know. And it's been awesome to see the early response to that. Please go sign up for that. Support Locked On Pelicans that way as well. So I want to get into an interesting topic here, and that's about different starting lineups depending on the opponent on a game-to-game basis. You start one group one night, and then the next night you start a different one. And I'm going to tell you right now, I hate this. The too long didn't listen to this segment is Willie Green needs to stick to a starting lineup at least for the first 10 games. You know, there's talk of Willie Green using different starting lineups based on the opponent. Willie Green has even said that himself. So you're going against a bigger or more dominant center, you know, a Rudy Gobert, a Nikola Jokic, something like that. Then you start Daniel Tice, Yves Missi, or probably not Carlo Makovic. Someone like Alperen Şengün, who won't kill you in the post, you can play small and try and beat him that way. It all sounds good in theory, but I absolutely hate this. And here's a couple of reasons. Here's the main reason why. With how busy the NBA season is, you don't practice every day. It's 82 games, but you're often playing every other day. You don't get a full practice very often. Maybe 20 on the high end if things really go your way or your coach is kind of a bit of a hard ass. You'll get 30 in, so 20 to 30 true full practices. What teams usually do is not have like insanely detailed game plans for opponents because you don't have time to run through that, to practice that, and to put all of that into place. You have some of it, but you don't have like an insanely detailed game plan for, you know, other than opening night and some other games all that often, especially because lineups are changing with injuries and things like that. So you could do those at the beginning of the year. They're going to go out the window after the first month of the season. Basically what teams do, and the Pelicans have done this too, every team does this, is you figure out what you're good at. Here are our strengths. We're an offensive rebounding team. If you're the Celtics, we shoot more threes than anyone's ever going to shoot. You know, other teams are, we're going to get fouled and we're going to get to the line. We're looking at it from the offensive side, not the defensive side here. You figure out what you're good at, what your strengths are, and you leverage that and you lean into it. Basically, play to your strengths rather than fully react to your opponent. Not 1,000% of the time, but in general, this is what teams do. Think of it like an NFL game where you script the first 20 plays and you don't deviate from that. You're testing the defense out so that you can make some adjustments later as the game goes on. But you know what you're good at. You're a power running team. You're going to not just then throw the ball on, you know, the first couple of downs. You're going to run the ball. It's really as simple as that. So different starting lineups, it's not easy to do when you don't have time to prep. And it means a couple of different things. You start small ball one night and then a center the other night. Number one, that means you're not leveraging your strengths, at least not on offense. You're being reactive to your opponent. If your best 5 guys is a small ball lineup, maybe you should just be playing that. The starters need to win their minutes. The everydayers know I'm going to hammer this point this season. The Pelican starters did not win their minutes last year. You can't win a playoff series if that's the case. In the playoffs, your 9th through 15th guys don't matter. No one plays them. So when you're beating up on those guys, which the Pelicans did last year, their bench beat up on opponents' benches, that doesn't work in the postseason. It's why you saw them really struggle against the Oklahoma City Thunder, particularly without Zion Williamson too. But this year in a brutal Western Conference, your starters need to win their minutes. Your starters play the majority of minutes for you. You need to win those. If you're starting different lineups, what does that say, right? You're not leveraging your strengths. You're playing to your opponent rather than playing your game. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. 2, this basically requires 2 different game plans. Go back to what I just said about the lack of practices, the lack of preparation that you can do with some of this stuff. A small ball game plan and a traditional one. Do you have time to put that in? What if one of your centers gets hurt or someone else gets hurt? Do you have time to work another guy in to be able to kind of play some of those roles? No, you don't. And so that's why you need to have a starting lineup and stick with it so people know. It's kind of about creating an identity. And I think a little too much gets made of the what's the Pelicans identity talk. Look, you're good, you're good. I don't really care what the identity is. I don't think it truly matters as much. If you have one, that's great, but I don't think it's the most important thing in the world. But you should have a game plan that you can follow and that others can follow too when someone goes down injured. Say no Zion's playing. You've got to just kind of go next man up mentality a little bit with it. And you can't do that when there's multiple different game plans and you don't have guys that know what they're doing or have been worked into when it comes to that sort of thing. I don't like that for this team. Now, look, it's one thing if you don't fully believe in small ball. That's okay. Golden State Warriors, who popularized it, didn't use it all the time. It's totally okay to use it occasionally. But then what are your strengths? What if a center doesn't stand out? Are you just going to go with a subpar lineup because you're worried about defensive rebounding, because you're worried about other things? Play to your strengths. I hate the idea of different starting lineups. You can't kind of script things. You can't play to your strengths then because you don't have 2 different identities like that. You don't have 2 different things that are going to be equally as good. One will be better than the other. Go with that one. Now, maybe... And look, you can argue that small ball, even if that is the best lineup for the team, isn't the one if it doesn't work over long stretches of minutes. The starters for your team play the majority of minutes. You need them to win those. But you could also do it in different ways. You could go with small ball for the first 5 minutes of the first quarter, try and race out to a lead, pop in a center, take someone out, try and have that play even, close the first half with those guys, do the same thing in the second half. Start the second half with small ball, try and blitz them, and then close the game out if you need to with that small ball lineup if it's your more effective one. But I think Willie Green needs to come up with one game plan, so essentially one starting lineup, and stick with it and figure out how to manage that. And right now, the team doesn't feel like they've been doing that, and that straight up worries me. That is not something that I am particularly excited about. I'm pretty bullish on this team. I think there's enough talent here for them to be really, really good this year. And it's going to be on head coach Willie Green to figure that all out fully, 1,000%. That's what it's going to be. That's his big challenge this year. 2 different starting lineups, kind of varying it based on your opponent. I don't like that. Look, let Zach Edey go and get 40 against New Orleans. That means John Morant isn't going to be feasting. That Desmond Bane isn't going to be shooting. I feel like you'll still win some of those games. Let teams beat you up on the defensive glass. It's fine when you're making every other shot and they can't stop you. That can be okay. I think these are times when New Orleans needs to kind of go, okay, we're going to just be the best version of ourselves and play to their strengths. 2 different starting lineups, that's not doing that. One of those starting lineups isn't going to be as good as the other, and you're not playing to your strengths. I hate that idea. You can't figure out who you are. You can't lean into it either. And I do think then it's harder to make adjustments. And I just don't like the idea of being reactive rather than proactive when it comes to this team, particularly in a key year. Look, these games are going to matter, especially early on. You think this game against the Chicago Bulls tonight doesn't matter? Counts just the same as the final game of the regular season. They all count the same in the standings. These early games matter just as much as the late ones. This isn't necessarily the time to be like, let's figure it out. No. Figure out what you're good at based off your practices, because it's not based off of preseason, and go and do that. Come up with a game plan, leverage your strengths, stick to it. None of this back and forth stuff. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. Coming up next, y'all brought the spicy takes. We did this yesterday. It was fun. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more for y'all. We're going to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 and talk about what they mean for this season for the Pelicans. And that's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is my go-to ticketing app, and I love it because of all the features that they have. And Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. They've curated deals to make it easier to find the best price on great seats. There's also the view before you buy. You can see a panoramic view from your seat before you buy. So say you're in Odessa, Texas, like I am right now, and you're trying to go to an event and you've never been here before. Not that I'm doing that, but if I were, I'd get on Game Time and I'd look at the view from the seat before I went, so I got the tickets that I want. And then there's the lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and other features as well. So I love Game Time because of all of those additional features. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, even in Odessa, Texas, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast for a reason. I'll be back in New Orleans on Thursday night. So I appreciate you all so much for listening to this episode. If you're a new listener, thank you for tuning in and making Locked On Pelicans part of your day. This is the type of analysis you're going to get Monday through Friday. If you're a longtime listener and everydayer, I appreciate you riding with me for another season here. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson going to make sense of everything black and gold. What's left to play for this season? Can they get a top 5 pick? Who would they take? What would that look like? He's going to be covering everything black and gold over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And again, the Locked On Pelicans newsletter. You can subscribe for free right now at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com. And start your day with the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter. So let's get into some spicy takes here when it comes to everything. And I am very excited to get into some of these because these are a lot of fun here. Spicy takes. We looked at these yesterday. Let's get into, I got 6 more for you. Feel free to put other ones down in the comments down below. We'll maybe do some of these over the course of the season too, because this one has been pretty fun. So let's get into it. I'll rate how hot these are. This one comes from @___DD9____. Some of y'all have horrific names to read out here on the show. And DD9 says, the highest scoring game from a player for the Pelicans this season will come from Jordan Hawkins with 55 points. Yeah, that's a 5 out of 5, I'm here to tell you. He definitely could do it. That type of shooting, if the Pelicans really lean into the 3-point shooting, and they need to, and Willie Green was talking about the other day, Jordan Hawkins is absolutely a rotation player. I think he's leaning a little bit more offensively, Willie Green is, than he has before. Hawkins has the green light. We saw it in preseason. That dude is allowed to shoot whenever he wants. There are going to be games when he is on fire. With Zion Williamson, with a point guard in Dejounte Murray, this is a guy who I do think will get wide open looks. I don't know if he's going to get enough minutes per game to get to 55, but if there's a way to do it, it's how he is, which is just taking those shots, taking those threes. Still 5 out of 5 because Zion's on the team, CJ's on the team, Ingram's on the team, Trey's on the team. Those guys are going to be getting the majority of shots. You trust them to score a little bit more than Hawkins does. Still a 5 out of 5. I could have maybe rated it a 4.5 out of 5, but I wanted to go 5 out of 5 here. So moving on. This one I thought was actually pretty interesting, and I struggled with how to score this one. It comes from @Evan__AC, just tons of underscores here. Javonte Green plays more minutes than Jose Alvarado this season. This one's like a 3.5 to me. It's like slightly above halfway here. Jose Alvarado, it feels like he's the backup point guard for this team, but we've seen him get minutes, not get minutes, did get rewarded with a new contract this offseason. But we've also seen guys like Javonte Green just be Willie Green favorites. And if that's the case, you're going to get minutes. And Javonte Green kind of has some of that like Najee Marshall attitude in him. And Willie Green loved Najee Marshall. So yeah, I could absolutely see Javonte Green getting a lot of minutes. Jose was banged up last year too. that can kind of impact it. He maybe has a bit of a penchant for getting injured compared to some other guys. So that's where I can kind of see this. But Jose Alvarado is definitely above him, I think, in the pecking order here. If Willie Green does want to go more offensively minded, Jordan Hawkins is likely above Green as well. That I think kind of factors into it, but it's Willie Green as a head coach. We can absolutely see this happening in, some capacity. So I got a double one here for you. First one comes from at NBA_Dunboy, DUNNBOY. And he says, I don't want to assume, CJ gets traded for DeAndre Ayton. I don't think that's that hot. I think maybe for Ayton, that's kind of hot. So I'll put it at like a 2.5 that we're trading specifically for DeAndre Ayton and sending CJ back to Portland where, he was before the Pelicans traded for him. Be a nice homecoming. I don't think they particularly want him, obviously, hence they traded him. But they drafted Donovan Clingan in the first round in the lottery, and he has looked good in preseason. That is their center of the future, the guy that they are going to build around alongside Scoot Henderson. So, yeah, you could see Ayton getting moved if they would just want to try and get assets or something like that. And then following up on this, at Army Caruth, Carruth, CJ gets traded at the deadline. So it's kind of piggybacking off of this. That one's a 1. I did a show where I basically gave you 3 spicy takes earlier in the offseason, and one of the big ones was CJ's traded. And if you listen to yesterday's show talking about the Trey Murphy extension, one of or both CJ McCollum and Brandon Ingram aren't going to be on the roster next season. It just kind of means that. Right now we lean towards Brandon Ingram, but it easily could be CJ McCollum as well. And so him getting moved doesn't shock me whatsoever. All right, couple more for you before we wrap up and get you set for opening night here. This one comes from at Cameron and 6357961. Y'all get better Twitter handles, please. And this one says, Herb turns into prime Draymond Green and wins Defensive Player of the Year. I did this show too. We did the show of how Herb Jones wins Defensive Player of the Year. And it's if the Pelicans go with a small ball lineup. Herb defends the 5 and plays that Draymond Green role, even though it'll be Zion as well and others. But Herb kind of anchors some of those lineups. Yeah, he's going to absolutely get a ton of votes for Defensive Player of the Year. He was the first non-center getting votes for Defensive Player of the Year. And that, says something here. And so if you're guarding centers and you kind of add that to your toolkit as well, along with making the all-defensive first team, yes, absolutely, you can see a world where Herb Jones wins Defensive Player of the Year pretty easily. Okay, two more. Bucks K3TZ. Carlo becomes the Pelicans' most used center. It's a 5. I'm going to say that is a 5. 4.5. Centers aren't great, so Carlo easily could kind of get in there because they don't look particularly good. But he hasn't really played in preseason. I don't think he's in the rotation anywhere close to it to start. He doesn't have the NBA experience, was a second-round pick, doesn't have the playing experience. Nice guy to talk to, and he knows he's got to work his butt off to get out there on the court. But I think you're going to see him playing in Birmingham for the most part. Maybe his career, continues with New Orleans after that more as a backup or something along those lines. And then the final one here. At Pittsburgh, BOURG 5323. And they say simply 82-0. 5 out of 5. Pelicans go undefeated. We're going to have the most fun on the show this season. So I hope that's the case. But no, that one's not really realistic. But I figured we'd end there and get you set for the start of the regular season. Of course, here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We will recap the game tomorrow. I will be watching it, just won't be there. We'll break it down, what we saw from the starting lineup, some of the rotations, what we learned, because this game is going to teach us a lot about where this team is. Tomorrow's show is going to be a really important one. You don't want to miss it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Don't forget the Locked On Pelicans newsletter. You can go to lockedondaily.com to sign up for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow to recap opening night.